Chapter 12. Jacob's returns. The truth is always the hardest thing to hear or tell. Human intentions always seem to get perverted. I guess redemption is the same as success in that way. The manifestation of your intent. The young boy's body was wrapped in blankets. His face, still and peaceful, shone in the light of the fire. Charla fought tears as she wrapped him. She spoke with anger about how these children suffered. Matt knew she missed Jimmy so much, and perhaps that was the real fire behind her angry tears. She had been robbed of her Jimmy. Nonetheless, she had such great strength in her. The strength was a well for Matt. A well in which he could turn the strength he drew and transcend it tenfold inside his own heart. Charla assured Matt that the boy died peacefully. But he was awake, asking for his caretaker, Aylin, at the moment of his passing. This was news Matt could not bear to pass on to Aylin. Charla told Matt of the boy's story she got from him before he left them. He and the rest of the children that Aylin and the other woman took care of were part of a daycare center. It was on the outskirts of St. Paul. It was a story that indicated that all the people whom they led to the mysterious secret city were blessed with such providence. When the bombs went off, there were such incredible circumstances that allowed each person whom now followed to survive. Some who survived the bombs died of the radiation from the fallout. Others died due to criminal acts, owing to the chaos of the shock to the American society. And still others didn't make it through the winter without heated shelters. Others died of starvation because of lack of food in their own prospective area. These few survivors had survived in the hundreds of miles because of circumstance, chance, and luck. It was all so random, and it made each and every one aware of their own fragile existence. And others, like the man who was so angry at his life a few nights earlier, came to resent their survival. Something in Matt caused him to hold on. Angela embodied whatever it was that pushed him on. For Charla, it was Jimmy, though in her mind, at times, it may be easier to just give up and find a way to join him. Nevertheless, she pushed on as well. Everyone there had to have a reason, a purpose, and each and every one of them happened to be strong enough to find it. "I can tell her, Matt," Charla said. "You don't have to." "No, I need to tell her." Charla looked at him. She saw the same masculine traits that she used to see in Jim. "Matt, you've got enough. It's my duty. It's my responsibility, Charla." Charla stared at him silently for a moment. "Okay," she said, resigning. Matt turned and headed back to the camp that saw Lynn and Angela. How would he say it? How could he break the news to her? Matt came to the camp. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon. He put his hands in his pockets and stared at the two ladies. The one he loved so much, little Angela, as well as the other. The one whom all his empathy was now spent. He was stuck, dead in his tracks. The moment was untimely beautiful to him. So much hope lay there sleeping by the dying fire. He stood, soaked in the sight he knew he had to ruin by bringing such news. Matt sighed and took a step forward, but he just didn't have the strength in that moment. He bent to his knees and looked at the trees that led the way to the heavenly dark blue sky. He bowed his head. "Lord, please give me the strength," he thought. "Please, let this pain be over. It's too much. I can't do this forever. I don't want to do this forever. If you're out there, please take this away from me and all these people." Matt prayed with his eyes and hands clenched so tight it hurt. The sun now broke over the far-off eastern edge of sight. He stood and walked over to the sleeping beauty. He stood over her and hesitated for yet another moment. "Aylin," he called as he shook her. "Aylin." Her body began to move as if she was readjusting herself. Then, her eyes opened, unveiling kind, pained eyes. It was obvious to her, and obvious to Matt, in her blue eyes, that she knew what he was going to say. "Tim's gone," Matt said, so softly. Her eyes closed, and her face creased as she let out a soft, stuttered cry. Matt couldn't face her directly, and he turned to see Angela awake, propped up, with her 2 arms at her sides. She got up and ran to Aylin. She hugged her. Aylin smiled. "I know he's gone," she said with tears in her eyes. "He's okay now." "I'm sorry," Matt said. Angela's hug receded, and Matt saw that she cried too. "The little boy died?" she asked. "Yeah," Matt said, and he reached his hand out to her shoulder. "Where is he?" Aylin said. "He's with Charla," Matt said, looking in Charla's direction. She nodded and looked to the ground. "Come on, honey," Matt said, leading Angela away with him. In the midday overcast, the boy was buried. Surrounding the funeral site was almost everyone. A huge circle was formed around the mound. Aylin knelt at the mound, fighting tears, as the rest of the crowd was silent. How the word got around so fast at what had happened was a mystery. In front of Matt, Angela knelt with Aylin, mimicking her gestures almost exactly. Matt looked at the solemn faces of the small children who could hardly grasp the situation. 9 little boys and girls, all standing, staring at the gravesite of one of their peers. Atrocity. Matt, who stood behind the 2 girls kneeling, could take no more. He walked away. Jacobs turned to see the city in ruins he left behind him. Before it, trailing behind him, was some older folks who were sick with the fallout poisoning. They probably wouldn't make it to the city, but he had to try. There was no questioning this. Jacobs wondered if he could still find the rest of the group before they left. Matt may have led them off already. It had to be almost noon, inferred from how the sun sat in the sky behind the gray clouds. He looked off to the east, towards home. Boston. He knew as soon as he got to Maddox, this would be his next destination. Only a few more miles to go, he thought. His new followers were slower than the others. He would get too far ahead and have to stop and wait. But he exercised patience. The 2 men and 5 women were in poor health. They only survived because of poor income housing in the basement of an old apartment building. The building had mostly collapsed, leaving them trapped below on the bottom level. As he walked up and down the street the day before, he called out for anyone who could hear him. One of the men who followed him, Larry, began banging on the door with a baseball bat. A Louisville Slugger, faux autographed by Bo Jackson. Jacobs heard the banging and moved the 3 planks of wood that had trapped them for months. It would have inevitably trapped them inside to their deaths. The others with him had been visiting. All in their 60s, they survived because of Larry's wife. She had made a hobby out of canning foods. They rationed in hope that someone would come and save them. A hope that almost died after being trapped there for almost 7 months. They weren't in good shape at all, but their spirits were high. And sometimes, that is all that is needed to survive. Jacobs turned to see Larry, still with his prized baseball bat in his hand. He laughed to himself. Jacobs saw in the distance a great crowd. They were gathered around something. He turned to the others following him. "There they are," he shouted back to them. "I'm going to run ahead. Meet me up there." Jacobs wondered what the strange commotion ahead could be. As Matt walked away from the group, he stared down at his feet. He looked up to see a WPF soldier running towards him. It was Jacobs. "Blair!" Jacobs said out of breath. "The hell's going on?" "A boy died last night," Matt said, solemnly turning to the makeshift funeral. Jacobs didn't say anything, but looked behind him. They walked from the group. "Any luck?" Matt asked. "They're behind me." Jacobs turned and looked. "They're sick and old, a little ways behind yet, When they get here, we leave. We still have a few weeks' walk ahead of us. Scott thinks another week, Matt said. Scott doesn't know shit. We had a couple 100 miles left to go. Matt looked off. Jacobs, we can't keep eating grass and random animals. These people are going to end up starving to death. There's almost 150 of us now. 168, Jacobs said. We'll do what we can. Jacobs paused and looked at the dissipating crowd. Okay, round everyone off. Let's go. Meet me ahead of the group and check in with me after we get going, Jacobs said. Before tonight, he added, as he started moving along. Matt nodded and turned right around. Matt listened to Dr. Carnell explain to Aylin the boy had died in peace. Still, she cried, showing strength in her holding back the overwhelming tears. The other children, are they going to be okay? Len asked. Yes, I think they'll be fine. Tim was the sickest of all them, right? Lynn shook her head. Yes, I'm sure they'll be okay. The doctor turned towards Matt. Matt nodded to her, thanking her for her service. She walked away from them. Lynn walked away as well, leaving Matt struggling with wanting to comfort her. The last stride toward the city had started. The day was hot and boring. The group strode along, tired and battered, but still they pushed on. Matt seemed to always know where in the throng behind him Aylin was. His feelings of empathy towards her, of compassion towards this woman, were strong. He could not figure out why. It made him exhausted in his mind. He just wanted to make sure she was all right. He could see she was strong, but it was just too awkward for him to fall back and find her in the trailing crowd. The night came quick. Matt, Jacobs, and Scott sat at a fire together once they stopped. Jacobs told of how he found the old survivors in the city. Scott laughed and seemed to not make much of the luck they all endured. With Scott present, Matt thought he might get some of the answers out of Jacobs that he needed to put together the rest of this story. So, Jacobs, Matt asked. Jacobs hardly broke his stare from the fire. How do you know about this city? Once the question was posed, Matt got Jacobs' attention. Well, Blair, he answered, the city was built in case something of this magnitude happened. There were always threats of things like this happening. As a matter of fact, we traced the very process of it happening. The bombs being put in watches, the factory that was blown in Argentina. That was our biggest lead. Suddenly, Matt couldn't know for sure if he was in a dream or not. He could not believe what he'd heard come out of Jacob's mouth. But there wasn't anything else like that in the area. That place was blown to high hell. WPF searched the world. It's just too big for one side to hide, and when one side gets big enough, the other side gets smaller. The smaller side snuck in undetected and pulled the foundation out from underneath us. Matt spoke up. Well, what were you talking about, Scott? Jacob showed up in Korea or something? Scott looked up at Matt, in shock. Jacob looked at Scott with the same look, and then to Matt again. So you're trying to put it all together, are you, Blair? He shot at Matt. I need to know what's going on here, Matt said flatly. It's too big for you, Blair. You're just a kid. God damn it, tell me, Matt said. Jacobs paused briefly. WPF Intel knew about the bombs. I was head of the reformed, reassigned Eagle. I was taken to the city for briefing. They didn't know when it would happen, but they feared something of a smaller magnitude would happen soon. The sect calling themselves Al-Qaeda, harbored by the Chinese. I was sent in to destroy them. None of us made it out. None. Except for me and Alder. The higher-ups in the government, the goddamn president himself, didn't believe the intelligence. We got out, we got to Korea, and we headed this way to get as many of them as we could back to the city. Matt and Scott were astounded at the story. What do you mean they didn't believe the intel? Scott asked. Apparently, he didn't know this part of the story. They thought we were fucking untouchable. We did everything we could. What would they have done if they would have believed? It wouldn't have been any different. Matt thought as hard as he could. Why was that so hard to tell me What the hell, man? Matt said, irritated, but almost laughing now. Jacobs looked at him, hard and cold. Matt thought about all Jacob's speeches, talking about a man redeeming himself. What? Do you blame yourself for all this? That's stupid. Shut up, Blair. There's a line. But what the hell is wrong with you? I could have known that. You made it seem like it was some great Blair! Jacob shouted. Shut up! Matt stared at him, in disappointment and confusion. It suddenly hit Matt. Jacobs obviously felt a great deal of responsibility for this situation. What could make the man feel that way? Matt thought. It's one thing if the mission just wasn't successful. But this was the world's best. He didn't go on these missions and fail. What am I missing? So what happened? Matt asked. You didn't find them? What? Jacobs looked at him in a sad shock. Everything was already in motion. Killing them wouldn't have stopped this. Matt was confused. So, Matt thought out loud. What? You wrote them a cease and desist order? We attempted negotiations, Jacobs solemnly said. It was our only option. Matt had never heard Jacobs own up to any kind of diplomacy. In the context of who he knew he was now, it made him look weak. You tried to negotiate with him? Matt said. Jacobs got up and left. Matt gave a cynical chuckle. Jesus Christ. Jacobs walked into the darkness, intensely, in thought. Trapped in memories of disappointment and failure. He was ordered by the almost tyrannical WPF to go in and destroy the Al-Qaeda organization headquarters and capture their leader, Tong Abudia. Just before the raid, he suddenly had the feeling come back to him that he experienced as his father beat him with that belt all those years ago. He could rise above the violence. He could be a heralder of peace. He could be in a position to make the greatest impact on the world if he could just get Abudia to see and believe what he did during that incident in his childhood. Killing them all no longer felt right in his heart. He had been with the WPF long enough to know that the force crushed the culture from the world, and at some small and disgraced point in his guts, he thought what they wanted was noble. The more time he spent enforcing Western ideals, the part inside him, rebelling against the things he spent his life on, grew. But he would never admit it, not even to himself. He did know, with his conflict twisting inside of his subconscious, that he was the wrong man for the job. But his pride carried him on. He had come to a point in his life where he sought out wisdom, answers, a point where he didn't want to decide what other people were to believe, what other people were to do. The part of his consciousness that lived his day-to-day life was now being overtaken by the part that wrote the narrative of his story. The invisible hand that claimed peace but herded humanity together into a working machine was now pushing Jacobs past his limits. In that dark place inside himself, the place he never looked on, though it called him, he felt that perhaps the purity of these people, sought through their radicalism, was another way, not a good way. But the fact that he suddenly began to understand proved he was not suited for this job. He felt he couldn't take another person's ideas away from them. The moment this inner struggle began to take over was the moment that they were to destroy this Al-Qaeda sect. He flew the white flag and told them they came in peace. They were captured at the entrance to their secret headquarters. The message that Jacob sent to Abudia impressed him, and he agreed to hear his plea. Jacobs and all his men were brought before the hunted terrorist. Jacobs remembered. I am Lieutenant First Class Jacobs of the Silver Eagle Task Force. I have come to you with knowledge of your attacks, and I ask you to cease their plans. Abudia did not seem to understand at first, but Jacobs knew well his prey, and he knew that he was fluent in many languages, English one of them. Abudia stared at him in pseudo-confusion. And why should I do this? This is my life work, to rid the world of the American evil, just as it was yours to defend it, your American way. It poses a threat to everything pure. The world must be purified. Abudia was testing him. There is purity in America, I promise you that. Our way will not live forever. But I tell you that my men and myself, we have families that we are only trying to protect. There has to be another way. Jacob sounded like a madman to the other men, their lives in his hands. There was a long pause. I am amused at you, said Abudia. You come in there, unarmed, and you ask this of me? To not rid the world of the evil empire? The empire that wishes to create slaves out of us all? He looked at him gravely and studying, but with honor, veiled admiration. You know I must certainly kill you. More of the test, tempting his adversary. Abudia, I know how endowed with the philosophical arts you are. Jacobs revealed to the man just how much he did know and study his enemy. The whole world is too much for one man to change, especially with an evil act as this. You know this. Jacobs was almost begging, and for all of the evils, I will bear them to bring a better world. The cost is on my soul. You are a man of intelligence, I see. Why do you come here? To die. Because my wife and family are in Boston. I haven't seen my son in 10 years. My wife has lived her whole life without me. Please, I beg you, for the sake of a life, your guilt could never sway me, Abudia said. In the chair in front of the room, Abudia crossed his legs and rubbed his chin. He continued to speak. When I was a young boy, my father led this very organization. A man came from America, paid my father much money to bomb a stadium in New York City. My father hated the face of America, the lack of honor, and the sin. Though he became obsessed with the idea of riches, and he accepted the money. The American wished to make a business out of the purifying purpose of our organization. The man who came from America had a very beautiful and expensive watch. He was dressed in expensive garments. My father longed for such luxury, and he accepted the man's offer. You see, I observed my father's lust over the other man's life. He became obsessed with the American dream of materialism, riches. My father would only talk of how magnificent the man's watch was. The man's very presence caused the temptation that urged my father to do such a dangerous thing. When he failed, he was killed. Do you think I would make the same mistake now? Abudia's people were surprised at the story. You've said yourself, the world is too big for one man to change alone, without much evil. You say you wish to bear this burden? Abudia continued. I only wish to serve my people, to bring them to safety, Jacob said. As do I. This is why we are enemies. We have the same cause on opposite sides. This is the most dangerous enemy, because there can be no understanding. There was silence in the room. The soldiers in the Silver Eagle stood behind, watching in trepidation. Each of them knew the vain attempt was failing, but they all had hope in Jacob's diplomacy. It was all they had. He had led them like a warrior through so many victories, fighting. This battle very well could have been won using arms. But now, Jacobs had chosen other means. And so, Lieutenant, were you to come and destroy me and my men? Jacobs nodded. And instead, you come to bargain the fate of your world with me? I come to ask for what all men want. Peace. I assure you that there will be no peace if I cease the attacks. Jacobs knew what he was getting at. It is not that I will save the world, Lieutenant, but it is I who can create space for the world to be saved. Abudia paused in his arrogant wisdom. I know of you well. Your reputation precedes itself. But you come to me begging for your family's life and the corruption in which you come from. Your family is dead, and they will remain dead with many of your country and people, and they die for the future of our world. I cannot stop the bombing. What I have set in motion is out of my control now. It has little to do with myself or my father. It is not I, then. It is another that will give the world back to its people. You and I are the same. We understand what is right, and that what is right is greater than human understanding. We are the ones who see the truth. And for that, my friend, you may live. Jacobs heard gunfire, and all his men behind him were gunned to the ground. Only Jacobs and Alder stood, watching gravely over their men's lifeless bodies. The act was quick and fierce. Jacobs remembered the screams of horror and the feeling that he'd betrayed his men, more loyal to him than even his family. The massacre was not far from his mind at any point, and on this night, it was almost as if it happened again. Jacobs remembered the echo of his own scream. The room was filled with the silence of 9 dead men. Abudia stood up and walked towards Jacobs. I told you, the attacks are now out of my hands. But I do wish for my friend to find peace. Abudia held a gun out to Jacobs. He was offering him the gun to shoot him, to kill the man behind the deaths of so many WPF. You would find peace in killing me? Jacob snatched the gun from his hands and pointed it, point blank, at Abudia's head. The men behind Abudia all aimed back at Jacobs. Abudia quickly broke in. Put your guns on the ground, he commanded, in the language of his people. Jacobs turned and watched them. He turned back and pushed himself to pull the trigger. There was no fear in the man, Abudia's eyes. Jacob couldn't make himself do it. Instead, he turned and killed the 5 other men with 5 quick shots. He turned and put the gun back to Abudia's head. He looked deeply into his eyes. You see, we are both killers. Jacob said nothing. He looked towards the door. Alder stood back, trying to get his head around the situation. You're free to go, though you have nowhere to go. Your country is in ruins by now, Abudia said, provoking Jacobs. Jacobs tried to pull the trigger one last time. He couldn't do it. He made for the door. Jacobs stared off at the black night that had come over the camp. If I would have killed him, what would it have been for? Revenge? He thought, still considering the grave memory. He had made the decision not to waste time with revenge and only rescue what he could of the people he protected in America. His attempt at diplomacy had failed, yet he could not believe there was no way to stop the bombs that would soon go off. And for this, he bared the burden of hundreds of millions of lives. Jacobs returned to an apocalyptic countryside, ruined and fallen. He did well, not considering the responsibility. Although tonight, he did. He could no longer keep it buried. Now, he stood away from the camp, gun to his head. Just as he had let Abudia live, deciding in that pivotal moment that tormented him, he knew that he could not pull the trigger. And so, he forced himself back into line. He didn't intend to hold the information back from Blair. He just couldn't face it himself. Blair would put it all together eventually. Jacobs could feel a kind of spiritual kinship with Blair. It was similar to how he felt about Abudia. Blair was the same, in some indescribable way. Jacobs wrestled with this feeling of admiration for his sworn enemy, Abudia. It flew in the face of the works of his life. He strangely saw him as a man of honor, in search of some kind of universal truth. He did not expect this upon their meeting. He expected a madman, which he certainly was. But he was not a madman motivated by primal urges for power, domination, and revenge. Abudia was motivated by a painful study of life, his own and those of his people, an observation of society, painfully selfless and dehumanized. Is it not a selfless ask to commit yourself to a cause that you think will improve the course of humanity? Jacobs wondered. Abudia remained one of those rare characters in history that bring their philosophy to bear on the world. Thoughts made flesh, and all that. But the matters at hand were those of country and state. This was the responsibility bestowed on him. Philosophers don't fight wars, shouldn't fight wars. Philosophers write about their meaning after. A philosophy can manipulate hundreds of thousands of lives. A philosophy presented with the proper charisma and in the proper time had the power to change the destiny of humankind. Jacobs remembered Aboodi's last words as he ran. "Save as many as you can." Almost as if he mocked him. Jacobs would never know for sure, and perhaps it was even more terrible if, in fact, he was being sincere. As if the act that he was responsible for was simply part of his duty, part of his charity. That act that would end America was not something he wanted to do. Simply the execution of a philosophy, not a personal crusade. Alder never questioned Jacobs' actions that night. He only followed Jacobs on the long journey that ended in the lodge in Pennsylvania. Jacobs never had the opportunity to discuss that night with Alder. He didn't know if Alder understood what happened, if he blamed Jacobs for the war, but he hoped Alder went to his death, knowing what Jacobs' intentions were. They were pure. Jacobs knew there wasn't any chance of his family being alive, but he knew he would go to Boston to find the site of their home. He'd try to make some kind of serenity with it. He heard Blair behind him raise his voice. "Man, you hit some kind of nerve," Scott said to Matt as Jacobs left them. "I hit it right on the fucking head," Matt said. He thought in anger, blaming Jacobs for everything. Scott was silent. "The man calls this whole war everything. He could have stopped it." Matt, overwhelmed with his anger, raged. "You piece of shit! You should have done your fucking job! You could have prevented this whole thing!" Jacobs drew near. "I did what you would have done, Matt," he said, appearing, a vague figure, in the firelight. "Bullshit," Matt yelled, surprised at his return. "Blair, we need to get these people to the city. If you think I made a mistake with what I did, then don't make the same one. We have a job to do. We do it." Matt couldn't argue. He wanted to. This made him even angrier, but he couldn't. "We worry about bigger things," Jacobs went on calmly. "Nothing I would have done could have stopped this thing." Jacobs paused, thoughtfully. "Think about the most precious things in your life, Blair. How the memories weaken you. How they make you ready to die, ready to give up. All the love in your heart. How it makes you want to act on that love. All the regrets, the triumphs. Think about what honor means to you. Think about how your future is your only safety, and how you want to walk in that future as a man of principle." Jacobs paused. "You're the same as me. Think about that. Maybe then you'll understand why I did what I did. Think about how you hate how cold you've been in your life. Multiply by 10. Then, you might have acted as I did. Think about how novel peace can seem in a life of war, for you and for everyone you love, and you thought you had your chance to make a difference, or at least give peace to someone else." Matt remained speechless. "Think about that chance being fucked up, Blair. What would you do?" Matt didn't reply. "Exactly what I did. Exactly what I'm doing," Jacob said into the silence. "There's your explanation. Now enough of your bullshit. There's a job to do here. We have the same purpose, the same duty. Let's stand on the same side. Otherwise, what you have is the formula for war. I'm sick of war. How about you?" Matt said nothing. "How about you, Scott?" Scott couldn't even look up. Jacobs walked away, back into the night. Matt was terrified at the mention of the watches in Argentina. There was no way that could be the same factory that put Matt down. The same factory that put 7 bullets in him and changed everything. It was something he could not look upon right now. He just felt anger, and his habitual soothes began to take place. Matt thought of Steph, and what he did to try to save her. The things he would have done. He knew exactly what Jacobs meant. What was right? What was wrong? It was all so gray at the moment. He thought about how cold he was when he left Stephanie, and how all he ever wanted at this very moment was that love that he walked away from. He thought of his sister, and how he went 3 years without talking to her, away with the WPF. He thought of all the stories told by the travelers around the campsite. The bittersweet longings for the small and seemingly insignificant things life once offered them at a more civilized time. He thought about Angela and Aylin and the man that he wanted to be in the future. The part of his awareness that wrote the story of his life was there again, pleading with him. He hated that he knew exactly what Jacobs meant, and he hated that it meant he couldn't blame him for what he had done. Perhaps he would have done the same. He hated this thought. In the raging fog of his mind, a clear idea of connection began to form. Matt felt ease in the parallel that Jacobs had drew between them. Something just out of reach was being revealed. He couldn't put his finger on it. He couldn't put words to it. He was discovering something inside of himself, but not accessible. Something outside of his perception. He watched Jacobs have the realization at the same time. It was mysterious, mystic, unknown, but poignant nonetheless. He realized he had known this from the moment they met. This has been an audio presentation of The Landscape of a Heart, an audio novel by R.P. Watts. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to this feed. Thank you.